Welcome back, everybody. We're going to start Unit 7 today. And in this particular unit is a stats unit. So we're going to learn some basic things about stats. We're just going to kind of scratch the surface. So we won't be doing every lesson in this unit. We're going to kind of bounce around to different lessons. But the lesson that we're doing today is Unit 7, Lesson 1. So this kind of introduces the different types of statistical studies or statistical questions. And basically, a statistical study or a question is, as it says here, it's a question that can be answered by collecting data. Anything that you can answer by collecting data is known as a statistical question or a statistical study. And what we're going to focus on today are the three different types of studies. There's a survey, there's an experimental study, and there's an observational study. Now, the survey is pretty self-explanatory. We've all filled out surveys before. A survey is a set of questions given to people to seek their responses. So an example of a survey would be like the online thing that some stores will put at the bottom of their receipts. Like if you fill out this survey based on your experience, you might get a free item or a coupon code or something, some sort of benefit. That would be a survey. Okay. Observational studies and experimental studies are kind of similar. An observational study is, as the name suggests, purely observational. So, in an observational study, the people that are conducting the study don't actually interact with the participants. A lot of times, the participants don't even know they're participating in a study. Okay. As it says here, you collect data without influencing the subjects directly. So the people conducting the study don't actually interact with the participants. Now that's a lot different for an experimental study. An experimental study is kind of like your typical scientific method that you learned about in science class. Remember, with the scientific method, you have a hypothesis. You test that hypothesis by collecting data, and then you, based on that data, make any possible conclusions. So in an experimental study, you are interacting, the people conducting the study are interacting with the participants or the subjects. You collect data by directly influencing something to determine how another thing is changed. It involves random assignment to a treatment group. So an example of an experimental study would have been like the medical trials they did when they tested the COVID vaccines. People agreed to participate in the study, and they took the vaccine and then they studied that to see if it actually worked or not before they made it available to the general public. An experimental study, unlike the other two, as it says here, can be used to determine causation. In other words, you can prove whether one thing causes another thing to happen by doing an experimental study, cause effect, essentially. The other two, surveys and observational studies, are only used to determine possible associations. They cannot be used to prove any sort of cause effect relationship. If you want to prove some sort of cause effect relationship, you need to do an experimental study. Okay. Lastly, in the lesson notes for today, things a researcher should consider when collecting data. Okay, you want to select participants that are representative of the larger population. Okay, if you are, for example, testing the effectiveness of a vaccine, you want to make sure you have a diverse set of participants. You don't want only boys or only girls or only people of one race, so on and so forth. You want to have a diverse set of participants that represents the entire population. Okay. You want to eliminate bias by selecting subjects randomly. The more random the selection process is, the less likely you are to have bias. Bias is obviously a bad thing. If you have bias in your results, they're not going to really tell you anything. Okay, you don't want to ask leading questions. Leading questions can lead to bias. The data needs to be collected and analyzed fairly. Okay, so you don't want to be biased when you're analyzing the data. You have to be impartial when analyzing the data. The data collected is directly related to the question. That's pretty self-explanatory. Whatever thing you're studying, the data should be related to that thing. Okay? And having a large enough sample size to minimize variability. So basically, the larger the sample size, the better you are. If you only select a few people to participate in a study, the results are not going to be likely going to be invalid. There's going to be more bias. It's not going to be representative of the entire population. Okay, so those are things you want to consider when you look at when you are collecting data. As far as the examples go for today's lesson, all we're going to do, as it says here, is we have some different statistical questions, and we're going to determine whether those questions represent a survey, an observational study, or an experiment. So we're going to go through each of these 8, and we're going to determine, based on the notes that I just explained, is it a survey, is it an observational study, or is it an experimental study? So let's take a look at number 1. Why are students missing so much school in the district? A district administrator selects 300 students' names at random from the enrollment list and sends a letter to each student's home. The letter includes a page to be returned to their school, signed by a parent or guardian. The page asks, how many days has your student missed school this year? What are the reasons for missing school on those days? This right here is a classic example of a survey. I'm going to label that S for survey. Okay. Essentially, they selected the participants at random. That letter is with the set of questions. That is the survey. So number 1 is definitely a survey. Number 2, why are students missing so much school in the district? A district administrator chooses one of the elementary schools in the district and asks the principal to provide information about the number of absences and the excuse notes provided to the school. Okay, so this one is not a survey. They're not sending a questionnaire to the students. Notice that the administrator is not actually interacting with the students in this particular example. They're just gathering the data from like the district records. Okay, so because they're not actually interacting with the students, with the participants in this study, this would be an example of an observational study. So I'm going to label that O for observational study. Okay. Number 3, what type of sweetener do flies prefer? A scientist puts the same amount of each sweetener into different bowls of water and counts the number of flies that drink from each bowl in 4 hours. Okay? This one's kind of tricky because the participants are not human. The participants are flies. Okay? The question is, does the scientist actually interact with the flies? Does the scientist force the flies to drink from one bowl versus another bowl? The answer in this case is, of course, no. Okay, all the scientist does is put out these bowls and simply observes what happens. So because there's no interaction with between the scientist and, in this case, the flies, this would also be an observational study. So I'm also going to label this O. Okay. Number 4, what type of sweetener do flies prefer? A scientist divides the flies into different groups and gives each group only water with a certain type of sweetener in it for 3 days. Okay, the scientist then does a test on each group to see how well the flies can fly through a maze. Okay, so this one's a little different from number 3. Notice in this particular case, the scientist actually divides the flies into groups and forces the flies to drink a certain type of sweetener. So there is that interaction. In addition, the scientist has the flies do a test. Okay, again, there's interaction involved. So this is actually going to be an experimental study because of that interaction component. So I'm going to label number 4 E for experimental study. Number 5, is there a link between dark chocolate and weight loss when compared to milk chocolate? A nutritionist asked 5 friends to eat dark chocolate along with their usual food for 6 months, and 5 other friends to eat milk chocolate along with their usual food for 6 months. The nutritionists then compares their weight after 6 months to their weight before eating the different chocolates. Okay, this one's kind of tricky. Okay, the key is that he asks 5 friends to eat dark chocolate and then asks 5 other friends to eat milk chocolate. So it's not a survey. There is an interaction component to it because he's asking his 5 friends and then comparing their weights. So in this case, I would consider this also an experimental study for the same reason. Okay. Number 6, is there a link between dark chocolate and weight loss when compared to milk chocolate? A nutritionist gathers 60 people selected at random, then randomly assigns half of the group to eat a single dark chocolate bar after dinner each night, and the other half to eat a single milk chocolate bar after dinner each night for 6 months. Everyone is to keep track of the other food they eat in an app provided. The nutritionist then compares each person's weight after the 6 months to their weight before eating the different chocolates, accounting for the other calories consumed. This is also going to be an experimental study because of that interaction component. Okay, this nutritionist is asking half of the people to eat dark chocolate, half the people to eat milk chocolate. So there's an interaction component. The other thing that's important in this case is the randomness. So he selected 60 people at random and then randomly assigned each of them to the dark chocolate group and the milk chocolate group. Okay, so number 5 and number 6, even though they're different processes, they're both examples of experiments, experimental studies. However, number 6 would probably be better, would probably yield better results because of that randomness aspect. They're both considered experiments, but asking your friends is a lot different than selecting people truly at random. All right. Number 7, do voters in the district favor a sales tax increase of 1% to fund the Parks and Recreation Department? A politician sends a letter to 300 voters in the district asking, would you pay extra money on your essential groceries to hire more government workers to plant flowers around the town? Okay. The key in this case is the politician sends a letter. That's like a questionnaire. So this would be an example of a survey. Number 7 is a survey. Number 8, do voters in the district favor a sales tax increase of 1% to fund the Parks and Recreation Department? A politician sends a letter to 300 voters selected at random in the district asking, would you be in favor of a 1% increase in sales tax to fund the Parks and Recreation Department in town? Okay, again, this would be an example of a survey because you're sending a letter. Okay, these are both surveys, number 7 and 8. But notice number 8 is a little different because there's the random aspect. So even though number 7 and number 8 are both surveys, number 8 would probably yield better results better results to answer the question because of that randomness aspect. So again, the purpose of this lesson is to simply be able to identify the differences between a survey, an observational study, and an experimental study. That is it for lesson 1.